prospect for negotiating a solution on Bosnia with the talks broken off now?
Well, as you know, the Secretary is going to hear about how the talks have gone right now, and we continue to hope that the parties are able to work out a settlement. The President believes this is a serious situation. He's taking it very seriously. We have an intensive review going on right now by the National Security Council and advisors, and we continue to review our options.
That's our George Stephanopoulos 31 years ago in a former life at the start of the Clinton administration, facing questions from the press on Bosnia, just one of many global crises he witnessed firsthand from the White House. George's fascinating new book, The Situation Room, the inside story of presidents in crisis, delves into the history of the secret White House Nerve Center, where some of the nation's most profound decisions have been made. I sat down with him this week to discuss that extraordinary history.
It's the most secure location in the White House, first set up by President John Kennedy in 1961 to coordinate national security after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. But it was 2 years later, when Kennedy's assassination would throw the room into crisis and heartbreak.
There are actually recordings, audio recordings of the Situation Room talking to Pierre Salinger, who was JFK's press secretary, who was actually on a plane with several cabinet officials on their way to Tokyo. And what you hear in the tapes is the Situation Room duty officer, through a series of phone calls, telling Pierre Salinger, who was very close to the president's been hit. We're not sure how bad it is. 5 minutes later.
This is the Situation Room. I read from the AP bulletin, Kennedy apparently shot in head.
10 minutes later, we have to report to you, and you actually hear his voice shaking.
This is Situation Room. We have report quoting Mr. Kilduff in Dallas that the president is dead, that he died about 35 minutes ago.
And this was the actual communication from the day that John F. Kennedy was shot.
That was, of course, the day that Lyndon Johnson inherited the presidency and the Situation Room, where he would obsess on the Vietnam War.
Not only was he there all the time, he was calling the Situation Room all through the night for any scrap of information about Vietnam.
It looked like our 2 pilots are lost.
It looks like 2 U.S. pilots lost, and search and rescue is underway for them at this time, sir.
But one of the things I, as a researcher, and I think the readers will take away from it, is that you learn that that information is not necessarily insight. All the information in the world about what was happening at any particular battlefield wasn't really going to tell him how to win that war, because it was an unwinnable war. And deep down, he knew that. But he was looking for any chance he had to get some control over it.
LBJ's reliance on the room did not pay off in the end, which may have colored the perception of the room for his successor, Richard Nixon. But he was managing a crisis of his own making, Watergate.
Nixon hardly ever went to the Situation Room, but probably the most dramatic moment of his presidency occurred in the Situation Room without him there. It's October 1973. War breaks out in the Middle East, the first Yom Kippur War. And Nixon is overwhelmed by the problems he's facing. He is spending most of his time in a private hideaway in the old executive office building, drinking scotch and listening to Victory at Sea. Henry Kissinger is running foreign policy for the government. The Russians started to move towards the Middle East, and Henry Kissinger believed, and his team believed, that the only way they could deter them was to raise the nuclear alert level to DEFCON 3, which had only been done once before during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he did that basically without even telling the President of the United States.
If that weren't jaw-dropping enough, fast forward to a Situation Room meeting with the next president, Jimmy Carter, a nugget which George uncovered after reading Carter's diary.
Strangest story in the book.
It happened in the spring of 1980, just weeks after the failed rescue of the American hostages held in Iran.
There was actually a program in the intelligence community during the 1970s and 80s called Operation Grill Flame, which used psychics. And because they were so fascinated by this, they actually called a meeting in May so they could get a briefing on this parapsychology program. Jimmy Carter doesn't say a word, just takes out his notepad and writes one word on it and sends it across the desk. The word is hostages. "Can you do anything?" he asked. He was so desperate for anything that might help him find a way to get the hostages home.
Needless to say, it did not help. All of the hostages were not released until the day Ronald Reagan became president in January of 1981. And less than 2 months later, his aides would live another nightmarish day in the Situation Room. A gunman, once again, targeting a sitting U.S. president.
Richard Allen, who was Ronald Reagan's national security advisor, on the day he was shot, carried a portable tape recorder in the Situation Room. So you hear his top aides deliberating in real time, trying to figure out how to run the government with the president unconscious. And it really does capture the chaos, the fog of the equivalent of war. These people not really knowing what kind of shape the president was in, what the chain of command was. It captures a moment that became infamous when Al Haig, who was the Secretary of State at the time, famously went up to the White House press room and said,
"As of now, I am in control here in the White House,"
thinking that he was third in line for the presidency. And of course, they're talking about that in the Situation Room before he goes out there. They didn't bother to correct him because they thought, oh, well, he's not going to do anything with this. And it became such a famous mistake for him, an indelible mark on his career. But you also saw the human moments of them trying to figure out what capacities the president had to continue to do his job. And it's really the only real-time record of that kind that was ever made in the Situation Room.
There has been great sadness, but moments of incredible triumph as well. Like May 2011, when President Obama and his advisors watched 24 Navy SEALs carry out the raid that killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden.
I interviewed Pete Souza, President Obama's photographer, who was stuck in the corner of the room, just flashing, hitting the shutters as fast as he could. The most iconic photo ever taken in the Situation Room. President Obama famously said, when after all the intelligence came in on where Osama bin Laden was, whether that person, the pacer, was indeed Osama bin Laden, he says, listen, in the end, it's a 50-50 call, and you just have to make the judgment. But, as someone who spent several hours in that room, you are aware of the weight of history when you're in that room. And the history echoes through the room.
January 6th was one of the most harrowing days in our country's history. So I asked George about the role the Situation Room played on that day. What was going on in the Situation Room that day as rioters were storming Capitol Hill?
Harrowing. It was a harrowing day inside the Situation Room. I talked to a duty officer named Mike Stiegler, who it had been his dream to work in the White House, and he was on duty on January 6th, getting real-time reports from the Vice President's Secret Service detail about how much danger the Vice President was in. He and his colleagues started to implement the continuity of government operations. People may not know what that is. Those are the executive order first implemented by Dwight Eisenhower to figure out how the government could survive a nuclear attack, and putting everything in place, so the line of succession, safe spaces for people to go to. They started to implement those procedures. It had only been done once before on 9/11. They were implementing those on January 6th, dealing with a crisis inspired by the President of the United States. And all during that day, as they're dealing with this crisis, President Trump never once called down to the Situation Room, the nerve center of the White House, for any information.
Never called the Pentagon, never did anything. And when he walked out of the White House that night at the end of the day, I think you described that in the book.
Mike Stiegler, it had been his dream to work in the White House, and he couldn't believe what had happened, but he also knew that he had to steel himself for going back in the very next day. And that's exactly what he did, because like all those people who served in the Situation Room, they say, we serve the presidency, not the president. He feared that the institution would crumble that day, but it didn't. It still stood. And he was determined to do his part to keep everything going. But to this day, he and several of his colleagues who served the day, who still have a hard time talking about it, go to the Lincoln Memorial every January 6th, and they raise a glass to the fact that we didn't crumble that day, we stood our ground, and the nation survived.
Our thanks to George. And The Situation Room will be out on Tuesday. It is simply an amazing read.